Welcome to the Project Censored Show on Pacifica Radio. I'm your host, Mickey Huff. Today, this week in this segment of the program, we are coming up on World Press Freedom Day. And at Project Censored, we always call attention to the importance of independent media and a free press. And we also try to connect the importance of that with critical media literacy education. And right now, today in this segment, we are honored to have an extraordinary and expert guest, Dr. Andrew Kennis. We're going to talk about his book, Digital Age Resistance, Journalism, Social Movements, and the Media Dependence Model, part of the Internationalizing Media Studies series over at Rutledge. Let me tell you about Dr. Andrew Kennis, and we'll bring him in, and we're going to have a very fascinating conversation talking about the propaganda model and also his own media dependence model as applied to social movements. We'll certainly, as ever, get around to policy solutions and other things. We won't just be bemoaning the problems, but actually finding solutions. And Dr. Andrew Kennis is an expert in both of those endeavors. He is an invited scholar affiliated with the National Autonomous University of Mexico in Mexico City, where he serves as a coordinating member of a research collective based at the College of Political and Social Sciences. Dr. Kennis is also a nationally inducted researcher in a program run under the auspices of Mexico's National Council on Science and Technology. As a pedagogue, Kennis currently teaches graduate level classes at Rutgers University after having also taught at several other places, including Northwestern University, the University of Texas at El Paso, and more. Dr. Kennis also continues to practice as an international and investigative journalist, having reported from locations ranging across 4 continents and dozens of countries while residing in Mexico City. Andrew Kennis, we've circled each other in media literacy movements and independent journalist movements for a long time, but it is finally great to catch up with you and get you on the Project Censored Show. So welcome, Andrew Kennis, to the Project Censored Show.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here. Love your show, and it's a pleasure to be part of it.
So, Andrew, this is it's tomish in its weight. This is a major, dense academic study. This is the product of years of research and writing. The book came out in 2022, but the things that you talked about in the book obviously live well beyond, and the models and theories you have put together based on some previous other scholars, including Ed Herman, Noam Chomsky, Bob McChesney, who, by the way, gave extraordinarily generous blurbs and introductions to your book. Noam Chomsky, Daniel Chomsky, and also Bob McChesney, all towering figures in this realm of media literacy, media analysis, understanding and deconstructing propaganda. And so I guess that's a great place to start. Your book is called Digital Age Resistance, Journalism, Social Movements, and the Media Dependence Model. We're particularly honored to have you here, Andrew, because you are the synthesis of the journalist, the scholar, the analyst, right? You are theory and praxis embodied in a lot of ways, and we don't always see that. So going back to the propaganda model, right? Going back to 1988, Ed Herman and Noam Chomsky talking about how issues of ownership, advertising, elite sourcing, who's newsworthy and so forth, newsmakers and shapers. Then we had flack and boycotts and so on. And finally, ideology. Used to be anti-communism, but could be other forms of ideology. You actually, and we've done this at Project Censored, we've expanded some of the propaganda model to allow for social media, algorithms, bots, and so forth. But you've actually taken the propaganda model, and of course, you can say a few things about that. You've actually created something called the media dependence model, and then you've applied it journalistically to social movements. So, Andrew Kennis, can you please talk a little bit about that and introduce this idea to our listeners?
Absolutely. But just as long as you're speaking about feeling honored, it was a huge honor to be introduced by these fantastic scholars, by the Chomskys and McChesney, but it was actually the second biggest honor. The first biggest honor was to have the pleasure, the tremendous opportunity to be in touch with pretty much all the movements I wrote about intimately, firsthand, as a reporter and as a scholar. It really was, tremendous opportunity I wanted to capitalize on. That's what this book was primarily meant to be, was to, like you said, culminate a lot of research, whether on the ground through journalism or scholarship, into one work. And it's definitely an honor to be here with you too, Mickey. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no, it's awesome to have you here. So, and there's so much going on in the book, like you said, about the social movements. You are applying this, across social media. You have a chapter on caged children and Trump's nuclear option. You have several other chapters that specifically look at the pandemic era and news coverage of certain movements. You talk about how a reality television star won the Electoral College, certainly something we've written about at length. You talked about the Occupy Wall Street movement. I mean, so I want listeners to know that what you're getting on in this segment today, in our conversation with Andrew Kennis, is a scratching of the surface, an overview of a really deep, thoughtful, and important study through a social justice lens. And so I want to make sure that folks follow up on that and maybe follow more of Andrew's work, and maybe even try to get a copy of this book or get a copy of it for your library, since it's an academic publication. So Andrew, go ahead and tell us.
Yeah, no, I
Dovetail
mean,
us from propaganda model to this
absolutely.
independence model.
Absolutely.
Go ahead.
I mean, I mentioned social movements, and really the tremendous honor it's been to cover them, because that really is the biggest takeoff, so to speak, from the propaganda model. What I noticed was that propaganda model is a great model that encompasses a good deal of what we see in news media performance in the mainstream media, especially when talking about military interventions and the big topics, the big kind of macro level topics, as I call them in my book. But it didn't discuss enough really what causes the exceptions to the rule, and didn't theorize enough social movements. So that was the big contribution I wanted to make, while paying homage to the propaganda model itself. And what I found when I took a closer look at social movements, that in very similar ways to victims, individual victims, how they were getting dichotomized into these worthy and unworthy categories, where we, hear about victims that are, really suffering as a result of U.S. policy or their allies. We don't hear about them, so to speak, but we hear almost everything about it when an enemy state is involved, when there's a state that's hostile to the U.S. So this is the perfect example of that these days is Russia and Ukraine, contrasting with Yemen. There's a huge difference between those two, and in terms of coverage, in terms of attention, the U.S. is much more in bed and involved with and responsible for what's been going on in Yemen for too many years. And it's not really is involved, although it's becoming plenty more involved in Ukraine at this point. But initially, obviously, it didn't undertake that invasion, and we heard about it right away. I was all over the place. What I saw was that there was a similar thing going on with social movements. So if there was a social movement opposing U.S. policy in an allied nation or a nation that was friendly to U.S. interests, or at least not hostile to them, we didn't hear about them. If there was a social movement that was opposing, enemy states that were hostile to Western interests, and particularly the Pentagon, we would hear, pretty much everything about them. So this is the contrast between Hong Kong in 2019 that I talk a lot about in my book, as well as Venezuela and Iran. I mean, these are states that are definitely hostile to Pentagon policies and Washington, D.C. and Beltway foreign policies. And it contrasted a lot with Chile and Puerto Rico. But like I said, not only did I want to delve into social movements, I also wanted to delve into the exceptions to the rule, and as I call it, press exceptionalism. So while we didn't hear much about Chile and Puerto Rico, and this is all in the same huge year of global resistance, right before the pandemic of 2019. While we didn't hear as much about them, we did hear a bit about them, and in past eras, I argue in the book, we'd sometimes hear nothing about these kind of other movements that are analogous to those. So what was the big difference, I argue in the book? Social media and its utilization by grassroots activists have literally sometimes forced the mainstream media to pay attention, and public officials for that matter, to pay attention to things that normally the mainstream media more easily ignored. And so between this mainstream dichotomy between worthy and unworthy social movements, as well as the sometimes exceptions to the rule that we find more and more often in the digital era, that was the main things I wanted to evolve, from the propaganda model with. And I thought it was a more modern day kind of scope whereby social media and social movements matter as much now as ever before. But I still wanted to emphasize in the book, and I tried hard to do so, that while we have many more exceptions, and substantive exceptions, they are not without limits, you know? So while we might have heard, some people might have heard about the ruckus in Chile and Puerto Rico and the democratic struggles therein, it didn't compare still to their worthy social movement counterparts. You're talking about huge differences. And so while that bridge has been gapped to a certain degree by the effective utilization of social media, and literally by causing hell, I mean, this is what has to be done to get on the map when you're an unworthy social movement. While that has closed the gap somewhat, there still is a significant gap to talk about, because for a long time, we don't hear this as much anymore, but we had these digital utopian folks and who were kind
Right.
of, getting idealized in the internet. And while we can all acknowledge by this point, I think agree that the internet has helped social movements in a lot of ways, it isn't a panacea, because at the end of the day, we still have the same corporate mega oligopoly conglomerate apparatus that owns the mainstream media, that owns ChatGPT, which regurgitates in many ways the same corporate propaganda we see in mainstream media. That limits these exceptions. And so while the exceptions are important, and that's again kind of the gap I wanted to cover from the propaganda model, I didn't want folks to get too carried away with them either. So yeah, those are the main things I was really trying to accomplish with the book. And I know that later on in the segment, we're going to probably talk about policy as well.
Yeah, we'll definitely get to some solutions, some policy. We'll also be applying a media dependence model to some of the movements going on right now, the anti-genocide or pro-Palestinian, and how that's being framed in the corporate media. We'll also talk about maybe some of the student protests that are going on and how those are being framed. And that's talk about worthy and unworthy, movements, riffing on the Herman Chomsky. A big part of that, who's newsworthy, right? And who is not, and which perspectives can we hear and not, which victims, right? Which victims matter more than others. All of that is at play here. And you use the worthy, unworthy labels in that regard, riffing from the propaganda model. You also talk here, I was worth pointing out, in the beginning, when you're talking about the media dependence model, a political, economic, and critical media analysis of the establishment news system. I notice you say mainstream, and you've referred to it several times. We usually just say establishment, legacy, corporate over here. We understand that people think about mainstream media similarly, but there's not much mainstream about the 6 corporations or 5 tech companies that control most all of the platforms and outlets.
Oh.
So we try to get even more descriptive with that by calling them who they are. As Michael Parenti once pointed out, the so-called mainstream media isn't just close with corporate America or friendly with corporate America. They are corporate America. And their interests are deeply aligned. And you quote, not quote, but you're riffing on the late, great social psychologist Alex Carey here.
Oh, yes.
You say elite news outlets lie at the very heart of what late Alex Carey shrewdly termed treetops propaganda, where what is often presented and even is, quote, news winds up serving state corporate interest rather than the information needs of the citizenry. And again, that includes fake news, half-baked conspiracy theories. And in fact, corporate media has tried to reassert its dominance by claiming it's fighting the very things that it often promotes. Half-baked stories itself, their own conspiracy theories. Can you talk a little bit about some of that and how it relates to corporate coverage of certain social movements? Just give a couple more examples, Andrew, because your book is so filled with documented, rich examples and analysis. And I know we can't do justice to it, but if you could just talk a little bit about it to give our listeners a little more taste of how your media dependence model applies.
Sure. I mean, we could talk about the family separation policy
Yes, right.
chapter, because I think it really is a good case study that is very MDM-ish. It's very digital age-ish, because we have this policy that actually technically was a secret pilot program under Obama. Wasn't really publicized at all, and it wasn't really a fully fledged program as it became under Trump, who bragged about it literally, of course, first starting on Twitter. But at the same time that Trump, interestingly enough, was bragging about the program that soon became official just a couple of months later. This is March 2018, and became official, actually not even a couple months, it was like I think weeks after his tweet. There was a great case by the ACLU trying to combat that policy and stop it and reverse it. And there wasn't a social media outcry about this just yet. And as a result, the New York Times completely didn't cover good treetops propaganda example right here, in terms of neglect, didn't cover that case at all, didn't give the US people a chance to know more about what was going on, thanks to our civil society, doing its job and providing the checks and balances we need on our government. And meanwhile, the nonprofit Guardian did cover it, right? So nobody knew that much about what was going on or the efforts that were trying to combat this policy until actually Kamala Harris, in the Senate started grilling some Department of Homeland Security officials about this, until there was an op-ed, barely as a result of this, appearing in national media opposing the policy. And soon thereafter, a tremendous social media outcry. And interestingly enough, and in a very digital age way, there wasn't that much on the ground resistance, because the policy in the end only wound up really lasting from the time that people actually started hearing about it and around the Kamala Harris incident, the op-eds. Not even a month did it last, right? So that's a very interesting telltale, I think, example of how things work in a digital age. It can go really, really quick, right? So within this month, there wasn't really enough time to get a lot of resistance on the ground. It wound up not being totally necessary in the end, but there was a tremendous social media outcry. And that was enough to eventually got to the point where 4 first ladies were opposing the policy, including even Trump's wife himself, his own wife. And literally a day later, when she opposed the policy was reversed. So this is a very big digital age example where even when there isn't resistance on the ground, it is possible in theory to completely reverse a White House policy. Now, again, we don't want to get too carried away with idealization or digital utopian ideas, because sure enough, when the social media outcry diminished and there still wasn't really on the ground resistance thereafter, it took years, and it still actually is going on to this day, to completely get rid of family separation. When there wasn't that oversight and that pressure, there was violations of court rulings, and there was still family separation going on. And not to the extent, admittedly, that it was when it was in the spotlight, fortunately, but still, it just goes to show you what unworthy movements have to do, because surely the advocacy community for undocumented immigrants and pretty much mostly asylum-seeking refugees fleeing the U.S. drug war, what they have to do to get on the map. What do they have to do? They have to have Trump tweeting and going ballistic. They have to have a senator question this policy. There has to be a global social media outcry. There has to be for first time in history, 4 first ladies opposing a White House policy at the same time going public about it. This is what an unworthy social movement has to do to even get on the map, much less reverse a White House policy. Now, the dichotomy comes in again when the worthy social movements don't have to even do half of that, don't have to get the numbers on the ground that unworthy social movements do, or organize global social media outcry. They're just literally on the map instantly. And those are the gaps, and those are the unfair dichotomies that we're dealing with to this day, especially since really it's the unworthy social movements, ironically, and the unworthy victims to this day, whether they be in Yemen or in Palestine, that have to do so much more, even though they're the ones that are most linked to U.S. Pentagon and Beltway policies. So in a democracy, our press and our, the fifth estate, that's so important to democracy, their most important job is to make us the most aware of what our own government is doing and what we can potentially oppose by our own government. Perhaps secondarily, we also, of course, want to be aware of what states that are hostile to the U.S. and what other Western interests are doing as well. But in practice, and this is the big problem, and this is what both the propaganda model as well as my own media dependence model try and capture, in practice, that's flipped. So we hear and know tons more about what, nations such as Russia are doing, which is not a bad thing, but at the expense of being able to know what our own government is doing. So to the extent that US and even Western people know what's going on in Yemen compared to Ukraine, it's a big difference. And the same thing goes for social movements time and time again, even to this day. So 1988 was surely a long time ago, but that book was updated more than a couple
Yeah.
of times. And actually Project Censored had something to do with it. But this stuff does happen to this day, and
Yeah.
even with social movements. And that's what my book tries to capture.
Absolutely. We're speaking with Dr. Andrew Kennis. His latest book from Routledge is Digital Age Resistance, Journalism, Social Movements, and the Media Dependence Model. The book focuses on media dependence model and social movements. And Andrew, before the break, you were talking about, you had mentioned Russia again and Ukraine, talked about Yemen. We're going to bring Gaza into this too, which has been going on for a long time. But I know your book came out in 2022. But all this still applies. And just very quickly,
Absolutely.
just recently, I mean, well, right around then when this was coming out, that's when we saw the Russia invasion of Ukraine. And we saw terrible things happening there in that conflict. Secretary of State Blinken and others, made commentary about Russian violation of the Geneva Conventions. Very important stuff, right? And of course, supporting Ukrainian resistance against the invasion. And now, a couple of years later, when we see the same questions asked of the Secretary of State about whether or not the Geneva Conventions are being violated in Gaza, they just can't seem to find an answer. So it's a clear double standard. And at least in this regard, to me, it does sound like a pretty prime example of what you mean by worthy and unworthy movements, Andrew Kennis.
Absolutely. Israel and Palestine apply in three different ways. Unworthy social movements in both nations, whether it comes to Palestine or Israel, and worthy victims. Well, actually, we can add a fourth, right? Unworthy victims too. So let's go through those, right? So we have the unworthy social movement in Israel itself. Yes, I mean, this is a major ally of the US, and thus is subjected to plenty of favorable media treatment. And so when there's movements opposing major US allies within the nation itself, they don't get a lot of press. They often do not get a lot of press. And so very few people know, even though this was literally the precursor to October 7th, 2023, that millions of people were protesting against the Netanyahu administration, protesting against the corruption and endemic to the regime, I guess you could call it, pretty much, because Netanyahu is a war criminal and former general himself, by the millions in Tel Aviv. The millions. I mean, this is a nation that didn't even really want its prime minister to continue being prime minister, barely was able to, really be the head of state in the most recent election in Israel, and yet another example of an unworthy social movement. On the flip side of the end of it, obviously, Palestinian civil society resistance is going on for decades on end. This is the longest running military occupation in the world, and very few U.S. people, and even to a certain degree, people in Europe are routinely exposed to news coverage about the often peaceful resistance that has taken place in the occupied territories. Even to the extent where there was a fair study done on U.S. citizens' knowledge of what's going on in Palestine and Israel, and it was found very decidedly that most people in our country don't even know that there's a military occupation in place in Palestine, much less it being the longest running one in the world. So once again, a huge example of unworthy social movement, and often unworthy victims too, to the extent that it was plenty heavy and extensive even before October 7th, that Palestinian civilians are subjected to Israeli war crimes and defense, so-called defense, IDF, the Israeli Defense Force, repression of them. And this contrasts with the worthy victims that we saw in October 7th. So obviously, the amount of coverage and sympathy and empathy that were given to Israeli civilians, especially in the immediate aftermath of the attacks in Israel, was very, very disproportionate compared to what we saw to coverage given to Palestinian civilians beforehand, much less their civil society resistance efforts decades and decades on end. So none of this helps understand what is admittedly a somewhat complex and long-running conflict. When folks don't understand that very keenly, this isn't illegal, it's according to international law. in the longest running military occupation, much less familiar with the more peaceful and nonviolent sets of resistance that we've also seen long time in Palestine. As when we do see Palestinian resistance highlighted, it's almost always the most negative and violent form of it. So, yes, Palestine and Israel absolutely intimately applies to the media dependence model, including even the student protesters who have been
Absolutely.
repressed by their own administrators.
Worthy and unworthy protests. Go ahead, Andrew.
Yeah, I mean, you don't have to be a movement that gets no coverage to still be unworthy. So again, we see an example of student protesters in the States literally having to raise hell to get any attention whatsoever, literally having to be arrested. It's not that there wasn't resistance on these campuses all the way back to literally when the war first started. If you want to say it started in October 2023, say that
Okay.
the occupation is a war in and of itself, right? But the latest
Yeah.
incarnation, I guess, of the war had received plenty of student resistance on campuses throughout the country, both before and after October, even more so after October. But most
BDS, all that. Yes. Yeah,
Main
absolutely.
Street America, you know, for the most part, has didn't really know about any of this, and even to this day knows just a bit until literally students got arrested, were thrown off their own campuses. There was a group I was just in touch with because I invited a couple of students in it to speak to my class that replied to me, "Sorry, we're banned." Literally, this is an Aristotle State University, a Latino group that was acting in solidarity with Palestine. They're banned. So yeah, I mean, this is really the MDM in work, right? So when there's nonviolent resistance that doesn't result in arrests, that doesn't necessarily have hell breaking loose, so to speak, it's ignored. And then when finally there's some more radical action, so to speak, or direct action even being undertaken, there is at least some mainstream media coverage, but without the context that's routinely given to worthy social movements. And thus, what does Main Street see? Just student protesters being arrested. Who God knows what they think about that? They're not really the context that the country needs and deserves there.
So, Andrew Kennis, I hate to do this to you, but we have a few minutes left and we have a lot to cover. But I do want to cover the media dependence model and public policy because you talk about how another news media system is not only possible but necessary for democracy's sake later on in the book. And you have some really detailed tables where you describe specific kind of policy paths and avenues for media reform. And here we are coming up on UN Press Freedom Day. The merging of critical media literacy education and the importance of independent journalism. Let's have you talk briefly about, we've been talking about media literacy. I mean, you've been doing critical analysis of a lot of what's happening. In the last few minutes we have, let's talk about why the independent press matters. You talk about national nonprofit options, public works options, borrowing off some of the ideas of Bob McChesney, Victor Pickard, many others, a lot of folks that we both know. Talk to us a little bit about some of these solutions for a better, more independent, vibrant media that really that tries to erase the distinction of worthy, unworthy victims and talks about these in broader context. Andrew Kennis.
Yeah, I mean, first off, Free Press, which was founded in part by Robert McChesney and the media for the Mix Center in Philadelphia that Victor is involved with. Victor
Media inequality and change, yeah, with
right,
Rutgers
and
yeah.
Todd Wolfson. They do great work, and that was plenty of what inspired some of the reforms that I was advocating in the book for. But there also, we can just even look to historical examples like the BBC that the book covers as well. So in the United Kingdom, when people bought television sets, like a portion of that was designated toward the BBC, and the BBC is a tremendous nonprofit global source. And while it isn't a perfect one, and there's some legitimate criticism of it, we would stand a lot to gain to have something closer to that model in the U.S. And there's no reason why we shouldn't. Yeah, I mean, media these days, especially now more than ever, with navigating the fake news terrain and the internet and all the kind of unfiltered crap that's thrown at us, so to speak.
Yeah.
Is just as important and sanctuous as kindergarten education. This is what the book is trying to argue in grand part. So we take it for granted in the U.S. that our kindergartners go to a school that's a nonprofit, that isn't run for the most part by the Edison corporation,
Yeah.
and as was the case in New York State when literally a kindergarten went bankrupt.
Yeah.
And so thankfully that has not taken off that much, and we understand that that's very important and sacred, so to speak. These days, I argue our news media is too. So between the attacks, and we haven't even had a chance to talk about this, on professional journalism and
Yes.
cuts. This is actually a conference going to be going on in just another week at Rutgers about this topic. Deep cuts for decades on end to the professional journalists we have working out there. More now than ever before, we need our news media to be nonprofit, so we'll be unshackled from corporate advertisers, corporate owners,
Yeah.
and corporate marketing,
Yeah.
which influences to a much higher degree than any of us should feel comfortable
And
with.
framing, corporate framing.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
How mainstream news is routinely reported. And so I laid out a bunch of different ways that we can make our news media more nonprofit, whether it has the BBC funding model to get more money into nonprofits, or even enticing existing for-profit media, including even the New York Times, to go nonprofit itself. I think that would be a huge step in the right direction. And it's something that I wrote in detail about, and it gave a bunch of different ways to do this, whether the full jugular of having a completely nonprofit news media system, which I'm very much in the favor of, or at least one that's more so the case than it is today. Because when you compare the U.S., as many of us political economists have been doing in the news media realm, and how much nonprofit news media we have in the U.S. compared to even Western Europe, much less Scandinavia, we run really, really far behind, and precisely during a time when we need it the most. So, and that's something Main Street, when polled about, really agrees on. I mean, time and time again, U.S. citizens are telling us through polls, not dutifully reported upon by the mainstream news media itself, or legacy, as you say, established media itself, that they're sick and tired of big media. They don't trust big corporate media. They know that the internet is only to a certain limited extent a viable alternative, especially when the best nonprofit journalism we see on the internet is often marginalized. And so this is a situation where not only there's a democratic impetus for more public support, nonpartisan support too. I don't mean to make this like a partisan mission of any sort. And the BBC in many cases have succeeded in that. We need to emulate that in the States to whatever extent we can. So that was what I tried to chart out a map with, those tables you referred to in different ways, different options, whether it be at least a bit more support, including public nonpartisan support for more professional nonprofit news media, or a lot more. We literally are in the kind of time, the kind of era that we are in desperate need of that.
Yeah. My guest for this part of the program has been Dr. Andrew Kennis. We've been discussing his latest book, Digital Age Resistance, Journalism, Social Movements, and the Media Dependence Model, out from Rutgers. Andrew Kennis, where can people learn more about you, your book, your work, and how can they follow you or contact you online?
Yeah, I can be found on any social media just by looking for my name, whether it be Facebook or Twitter, and then also digitalageresistance.org is a website that's dedicated to the book. It lets you know how you can buy it even from independent bookstores. And so literally the title of the book, Digital Age Resistance, one word.org, is the site for the book, and where folks can find out more about how to get it. And also actually be exposed, because Routledge unfortunately didn't publish full color photos, as is usually the case with academic books. So that's where they can see there's a lot of great award-winning photojournalism that fortunately we got donations for, that's contained in the book, that's also featured on the website in its full color glory. So yeah, digitalageresistance.org. And thanks again for having me on today.
Andrew Kennis, thank you so much for your very important work, and we'll have to have you back on the show. There's plenty more that we can be talking about, and using your theories and ideas to analyze the things happening around us. Thank you so much for joining us on the Project Censored Show today.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Thanks.